Hello, if you can read, unlike me, then you probably know I'm doing something a little bit different today. I'm sorry if you have noticed a slight gap in my uploads because I've recently been having a bit of computer issues where I couldn't even play games at all for more than 5 minutes without completely crashing. I should have it mostly fixed by now. I'm still having some issues, but secondly, bit my tongue or something while I was sleeping, and the past few days it has like hurt to talk, eat, and drink. It still kind of hurts, but it's a lot better than it was 2 days ago. So I'm sorry if you can hear me talking a bit weirder than usual. But I really want to yap about the upcoming reaction buffs, which honestly I was kind of excited for. I was thinking maybe because of the dominance of Hyperbloom that it would become a little bit less relevant once these other reactions got buffed. But I realized that these reaction buffs are only what do you call it? Like, it's a roundabout way that just buffs Hyperbloom even more. And Hyperbloom and Burgeon, they're basically tied. It was kind of similar. But I think with these new reaction buffs, it actually makes Hyperbloom just even more better than Burgeon, which is honestly kind of crazy to think about. I will explain this now. Now, hear me out. So, for Hyperbloom, Hyperbloom is usually a really cheap reaction. I usually try to avoid using Hyperbloom just because it is that cheap. Of course, sometimes I do, as like, this is a team that I use against a lot of the new local legends, just because some of them I just didn't want to deal with. For your Hyperbloom team, you usually have your Dendro, obviously. And then you have some sort of Hydro Applier, which is usually going to be Xingqiu or Yalan. Your Electro as Cookie or Raiden. And your third slot is pretty open. All you really need is these three core and you have a full Hyperbloom team, right? And this is why it's so available to people, because of how Hyperbloom works. Hyperbloom is kind of like, how do I put it? Like a tertiary reaction where it doesn't rely on elemental statuses like above their head, as you see here. Instead, it creates this bloom. And so because it doesn't rely on the reaction statuses of the active enemy or whatever, you can also do other reactions on top of this, right? Like you see, I'm doing aggravates and I was doing electrocharged and all these other reactions on top of triggering hyperbloom, because hyperbloom only matters if it's out on the floor and it doesn't have the same internal cooldown as like all the other reactions. But Hyperbloom is entirely separate reaction because it only matters if there's a core on the ground or not. And because of how Hyperbloom is a tertiary reaction, that's why stuff like Quick Bloom works so well, because you can have someone probably not as high of a Hydro Applier. You can have the Electro trigger aggravate and get the higher damage while also getting Hyperbloom on top of it. I would say Quick Bloom, like an Alhaitham Quick Bloom, is probably stronger than your average Hyperbloom, especially if you have a well-built Alhaitham, of course. But when we talk about Hyperbloom, we're usually talking about low investments, where it's usually low AR accounts where they don't have all these resources, so they use a cheap team like Hyperbloom. I do have C2 Nahida, so they're probably even stronger, as you're seeing here. It's good for new players, but it sets a precedent that it's just this easy to achieve team comp. It kind of raises the bar for endgame of, you know, raising the DPS floor, since quote-unquote noobs has this high DPS team comp that's equal to a high invested like carry team comp with the new reaction buffs, which, by the way, I'll put the raw values up on screen right now. The specific bloom variant that will probably benefit the most is Hyper Fridge. Hyper Fridge is usually when you have a cryo applier or you have like a cryo DPS like Yola or Femine. One of the other interesting things is actually Shatter has gotten a huge buff, which the two reactions that have the biggest buffs is Electrocharged and Shatter, along with Superconduct, which this team all does. So not only does this team do insane amounts of Hyperbloom damage, you'll also be doing a lot of damage as AoE, which is the Superconduct, the Electrocharge. If you're using someone like Femine or Eula, you're also going to be doing a lot of Shatters. They have increased Shatter to be the same multiplier as Hyperbloom. I don't know, something like 0.5 or like 1.5, and it's now a 3x, which Hyperbloom is also a 3x reaction. That's why I think this team comp just has more damage potential than Burgeon, because Burgeon, you're not using Electro, you're using a Pyro, which with Pyro, you're most likely gonna be burning and you're probably gonna be vaping a lot. If you have a well-built Xingqiu or Yalan, that could be pretty significant damage, but it's also only single target. So yeah, Burgeon is AoE, but all the other reactions you're doing is single target. And Hyperbloom, yeah, it's single target, but all the reaction you're doing is AoE. If you're bringing Burgeon to a chamber, you're probably expecting it to be AoE. With the new reaction buffs, it'll just be less damage overall, because not only is it a lower cost like team to build, like overall, your Xingqiu, your Yalan, if you're using this team comp, you probably don't have them built very well. So the vapes won't be hitting as hard as it would in an actual DPS or like focused like vape comp, right? Oh my god, they die so fast. I'm gonna need these for Auroron. Auroron, I'm actually kind of excited about. Auroron, by the way, you know, Tug's color of shirt. You didn't hear it from me, but Auroron is basically a side grade official who is situationally better than official in AoE. So that is actually pretty exciting. We haven't seen something like that in a while, but especially since Auroron can hold the new 4-piece set, the Natlan set. Anyways, what was I talking about? Yeah, there we go. I got a shadow there. And that will be the same multiplier as Hyperbloom. Of course, you have to take into account Elemental Mastery. I mean, if you had Nahida's ult up, you would definitely get free EM, not to mention other reactions you can have going on at the same time. Everything in the overworld that can be frozen is like so low HP. It's so hard to properly test on. I know I'm not the best at explaining things, but because Hyperbloom is a tertiary reaction, Kuki could be doing other reactions at the same time as Hyperbloom. So while you're doing single target Hyperbloom damage, that honestly doesn't really matter if it's single target or not, having these reaction buffs are just buffing how much DPS Hyperbloom can do in AoE as well. So after the new update, definitely the top 3 reactions, it's going to be Quick Bloom, Hyper Fridge, and then regular Hyperbloom, which honestly is kind of crazy to think about. And like I said earlier, with how Hyperbloom is so easy to acquire, that like it's gonna raise the ceiling for how much MiHoYo has already raised the ceiling for how much DPS you need in Abyss. I think it's solely because of Hyperbloom and the relevance of Hyperbloom. Since they're buffing it now, it's only putting more of an emphasis. It's only putting more of an emphasis because of how accessible Hyperbloom is already. And older units, like even with their best team, like your best Klieg team, it's not going to be able to clear anymore. In order for Klieg to clear, you need constellations, insane buffs and stuff. Meanwhile, an AR30 with just a C0 Cookie, C0 Xingqiu, a Dendro, any Dendro, it doesn't have to be Nahida, it doesn't have to be any limited character, it can literally be Dendro MC. And they can have about the same DPS as a hyper-invested Klieg team with constellations, probably. I'm not saying anything, but it does make me kind of worried. MiHoYo has already raised the HP pool. I'm pretty sure I made a video on it where I mentioned it. It was like 200 and something percent, and it's like 375%. Now, I have heard from, let's just say, some dreams that after this Abyss, it's all going to be 300%. It's not gonna be like 300 something, it's gonna be 300%. Like, I think they realized that they definitely made it a little bit, let's just say a little bit too high of an HP multiplier. While everyone thought that Hyperbloom would become a little bit less relevant, Hyperbloom only just became more relevant because this is secretly an indirect buff. Let me go to a boss and do a full rotation of this Hyperbloom team comp. Now, this Hyperbloom team comp is a little bit well invested, I will say, because my Nahida, she has C2. So if you have C2 Nahida, you'll probably want to be doing something like a Quick Bloom instead of just a Hyper Fridge or a regular Hyper Bloom. I'll be using Fremine as my third spot. He's not that well built, by the way. That's actually pretty crazy how fast we killed that. I don't use Hyperbloom much, but I do have QK built on Deepwood and with almost 1000 EM. I'm pretty sure we're doing Superconducts, Supercharge and stuff. That was also all contributing to our damage. That DPS would only go up in AoE because Electrocharge is an AoE reaction. And by the way, this is pre 5.2. It's still 5.1 by the way. Look at the banner. This is before the buff even. After the buff, we'll be doing even more damage than what we were doing. I probably would try to show a Burgeon equivalent, but Burgeon is just so hard to build for. So you wouldn't be using an Electro. You're using, I mean, you probably could do on-field Klee, the like Burgeon, build her for EM. That'd be kind of silly, but usually you want someone like Toma or something, or you can even do EM Shangling. But the problem with these two is they require so much ER that it's almost impossible to build for Burgeon. Because not only do you have to stack EM, but you also have to stack ER as well. So once again, new reaction buffs that aren't buffing Hyperbloom or Burgeon, but it is also indirectly buffing Hyperbloom and basically putting Burgeon to the side, showing how useless Burgeon actually has been. I might be repeating myself, but Hyperbloom getting indirectly buffs, this makes me a bit sad. It definitely makes me worried about, possible power creep. Not that I'm saying there is a lot of power creep. Like, with these type of games, there always is a little bit, but you definitely don't want it to be too insane. So this new precedent of Hyperbloom getting stronger just makes me more worried about older team comps, and stages of older team comps getting power creep. The stronger a welfare team gets, that means the limited characters have to get stronger. After the limited characters get stronger, Abyss has to get harder. And when Abyss gets harder, less older characters will be able to clear older content. Now, I've been thinking about showing how to play Klee in modern era, which I probably will make a video on like next week after I do my video for pulling for Camellia in Withering Waves, which I have some interesting ideas of how to keep Klee relevant despite being such an old and kind of power crept unit. Now, I strongly believe that anyone can clear Abyss as long as you pull constellations and weapons for any character. That may seem a little ridiculous, but I mean, am I wrong? Come on, am I wrong? And some characters, especially older characters, have no choice but to rely on other characters to make them relevant or to make them stronger. Farina is a pretty good example of being a strong buffer that it's like basically required for any old unit trying to clear Abyss. And you might see that as a good thing, but I also see it as kind of a bad thing, because like what those strong buffers are the characters you don't like or don't want. Mavwika, Mavwika, Mavwika. Sorry, I also had like a Mavwika. Oh, sorry. I just had like in my throat like for a second. That's weird. Yeah, like what if there's a strong buffer that's coming and you just don't like them, and the only way old characters can stay relevant is if you have that strong character, but you don't like that strong character and you don't want to use that strong character. It's kind of a good and kind of a bad thing. Almost reactions getting buffs isn't a new thing. When we got Kazuha, and the swirl multiplier has increased as well. So it's not something that's new. It's not something that it's like, oh my god, this would never happen in a million years, why is it happening now? It's not like that. Gacha games, and especially for Chinese gacha games, is basically illegal to nerf. Things can only get buffed in gacha games, and especially like something with like Chinese law or something, it definitely prevents them from nerfing things. After these buffs have been announced and they're in the game, it's here to stay forever. But this also means that they won't buff something like Vaporize or Melt, like the base multipliers, which they easily could, and can easily bring old characters that are kind of irrelevant now or like not as strong. Maybe if they buff Vape, and Klee Vape can become actually insane, but then if they buff Vape, then it's like, well, Hutao Vapes, Arachino Vapes, like Diluc Vapes, they all also get the buff as well. So you kind of get stuck in this weird place where it's like, yeah, but these other characters get buffed too, so it's like, how can we bring these other characters to relevancy besides just having these OP dedicated buffers that not everyone will want to use? Mavwika. Ugh. Sorry, something in my throat. Of course, another solution is giving out free options like Hyperbloom. But like I said earlier with Hyperbloom, the more available a team comp is and the higher damage that team comp does, that just means the newer limited characters that will come out next, they have to be stronger than the welfare team. So while in the future they could release some type of character that's free and that's like really good, Pyro MC, Pyro Traveler, Pyro Traveler. Sorry, oh, I don't know what's gotten to me today. Something went down the wrong pipe or something. Welfare units are supposed to be welfare. If welfare units are too good over new limited characters, people are probably not gonna pull for the new limited characters. And that's something Hoyo doesn't want. So in order to keep up, they have to get stronger. It's a bit of a slippery slope. It's a bit of a hard place. Hoyo, especially with Genshin, Star Rail, not so much, but they've done pretty well with trying to keep power creep to a minimum. Not saying it has never happened or it never will happen, or that it's impossible that it will happen ever, but it's just definitely something to keep in mind. The reaction buffs, I am actually pretty excited for it. I definitely want to try out like a taser team with Auroron. I definitely want to pull for Auroron, so expect a video on him as well. That is, if I can get him, because 4 stars. I did say I was gonna yap, and I think I'm pretty much done yapping at this point. There's not much I can say without repeating myself. I guess the closing statements or my closing thoughts would be, the reaction buffs are definitely a double-edged sword. While I'm pretty excited to see the reaction buffs and excited to see new team comps and new viable ways to play different characters. Part of the double-edged sword is buffing Hyperbloom. Hyperbloom is great for low investment accounts, but yeah, you already know my thoughts on that. I'll spare you from me repeating myself, okay? But yeah, that's gonna be a little short video. Just a quick yap sesh, and I will wish you luck on your Chaska pulls, I guess, because maybe you'll be watching this later. Good luck on your Nahida and Hotel pulls, I guess, if you're still watching the same week as I uploaded this. Yeah, that's about it. See ya.